The airport's announcement system droned on steadily, reminding passengers to proceed to their departure gates. The bustling terminal was alive with hurried footsteps, the rumble of rolling luggage on tile floors, and the cheerful chatter of travelers excited for their journeys. Mr. James Walker sat quietly in the row of waiting seats. In his hands was a pristine white ceramic urn, carefully draped with a small American flag. He held it tightly, as though it encompassed his entire world at that moment. He carried little else, just an old, worn bag resting at his feet, yet his gaze was weighed down by memories of the past. A young white man, likely in his early 30s, took a seat beside him. The young man wore headphones, his eyes glued to his phone screen, occasionally glancing curiously at Mr. Walker and the urn. Eventually, he removed his headphones and turned to ask, "Excuse me, sir, what's that?" James looked up, his old but piercing eyes locking onto the young man's for a long moment. He gently placed a hand on the American flag draped over the urn and replied in a deep, emotional voice, "This is Harper, my comrade. He gave his life in the war. And I'm taking him home." The young man hesitated, momentarily unsure how to respond to such a poignant answer. After a brief silence, he shifted closer, speaking earnestly. "Sir, were you a veteran? Thank you for your service to our country. Truly, I have so much respect for people like you." James smiled faintly, though his expression remained tinged with sorrow. He nodded, his hand still gripping the urn. "Thank you. But Harper is the real hero. He gave his life to save me and our squad. I'm just keeping a promise I made to his family that one day I'd bring him home." The young man bowed his head, his eyes lingering thoughtfully on the urn. Just then, a whispering conversation arose from behind them. A middle-aged couple walked by, speaking softly but loudly enough for James to hear every word. "Strange, isn't it? Who brings something like that onto a plane? Who even knows if he's really a veteran? These days, anyone could fake it just to get special treatment." James didn't turn around, but his grip on the urn tightened slightly, as if shielding it from the cruel words. Sensing the tension in James's demeanor, the young man quickly changed the subject to ease the moment. "Sir, do you have any plans after this flight? I mean, once you get there?" James leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. "I'll take Harper back to his hometown. His family's still waiting to say their final goodbyes. It's been so many years." The announcement system echoed again, inviting passengers to board. James stood up, adjusted the flag draped over the urn, and carefully ensured it was securely covered. As he walked toward the departure gate, curious and judgmental glances followed him, like invisible thorns piercing his resolve. But James moved with quiet determination, carrying the heavy burden of a lifetime of memories. James was assigned a seat at the back of the economy cabin. The space was small and cramped, but he didn't complain. His old bag was stowed in the overhead compartment, but the urn stayed in his hands, resting neatly on his lap. He didn't take his eyes off it, as though even a moment's distraction might cause it to disappear. The young man, seated not far away, offered him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, sir. People will understand the significance of this journey. Harper would be proud of you." James gave a slight nod, his lips forming a faint smile in return. But his smile quickly faded, replaced by the weight of knowing that not everyone would understand or respect his actions. Some passengers in the cabin shot him curious glances, whispering amongst themselves. An older man nearby shook his head and muttered loud enough for James to hear, "Nowadays, anyone can claim to be a hero. Who knows if he's even a real veteran?" James took a deep breath, steadying himself. He turned away, his gaze fixed on the window. Memories of the war flooded his mind like a slow-motion reel of film. He saw Harper shielding him from gunfire, Harper's final smile before he drew his last breath, and the sacred promise James had etched into his heart. "Harper," he thought, his hands tightening around the urn. "We went through hell together. This is nothing." The roar of the plane's engines filled the cabin, mingling with the murmur of passengers settling into their seats. James Walker sat quietly at the back of the economy section, the urn on his lap covered carefully with the American flag. He adjusted it once more, his eyes filled with reverence and care, as if ensuring that his comrade was being honored in every possible way. A young flight attendant named Lisa approached him, her face adorned with a polite, almost forced smile of professionalism. Her gaze flicked to the urn, and her eyebrows momentarily furrowed before quickly smoothing out, as if she had just come to a decision about something. "Sir, what is that?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Her tone tried to remain friendly, but an unmistakable chill lingered beneath the surface. James lifted his head, maintaining a calm yet firm gaze. "This is the ashes of a fallen comrade of mine. He sacrificed his life in the war, and I'm taking him home." His answer didn't faze Lisa in the slightest. Rather than showing any sympathy or understanding, she nodded mechanically. "Do you have documentation for it?" "According to airline policy, I need to verify this urn." James frowned slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I provided all the required documents at the check-in counter. Everything is in order." Lisa's expression hardened. She placed her hands on her hips and leaned closer, her voice lowering but growing colder. "Yes, but I need to inspect it personally to be certain. We've encountered cases where passengers brought unsafe items on board, and it's my responsibility to clarify this." James tightened his grip on the urn. "Do you think a veteran like me would bring anything unsafe? Do you understand that this contains the remains of a soldier who gave his life for this country?" Lisa's lips curled into a faint, dismissive smirk. The polite facade she wore earlier disappeared, replaced by a haughty air. "Sir, I mean no offense, but rules are rules. We have to ensure the safety of everyone on this flight." James locked eyes with her, his gaze unwavering and filled with quiet authority. "This flag is draped to honor a hero who made the ultimate sacrifice. I won't remove it, and I don't believe you have the right to demand that I do." His words caught the attention of a few passengers nearby. An older man sitting close to James shook his head and leaned toward his wife to mutter, "Anyone can claim to be a veteran these days. Who knows if he's telling the truth?" Lisa straightened, scanning the cabin. Her eyes briefly lingered on the curious and judgmental faces of passengers who were beginning to take notice of the exchange. She seemed emboldened by their quiet scrutiny, a smug satisfaction glinting in her expression as she offered James a thin, condescending smile. "Sir, this isn't personal. It's just protocol. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to my supervisor." James drew in a deep breath, willing himself to stay composed. Before he could reply, Lisa pressed on, her tone now laced with outright criticism. "You should also understand that bringing ashes on a flight might make other passengers uncomfortable. That's another reason I need clear confirmation." Soft murmurs began spreading through the cabin. A young woman seated nearby wrinkled her nose and turned to the companion next to her, whispering, "This is so strange. Who brings something like that on a plane? What if something happens?" The young man from earlier, seated near James, rose to his feet. He looked directly at Lisa, his voice measured but filled with clear indignation. "That's enough." "Excuse me, miss," the young man began, his voice calm but firm. "I believe he's already explained very clearly. That's the ashes of a fallen comrade. He said all the documentation is in order. Why don't you verify that instead of giving him such a hard time?" Lisa turned to the young man, her polite, professional smile snapping back into place. "Thank you, but this is my job. I'm just following regulations." The young man shook his head but chose not to press further. James gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, a quiet gesture of gratitude. Lisa wasn't finished. When she came by with refreshments later, her demeanor was unmistakable. She set James's cup of water down on the tray table with a forceful thud, causing the liquid to spill slightly over the edge. Without saying a word, she glanced disdainfully at the urn in his hands before walking away, paying no attention to whether he needed anything else. A middle-aged woman seated across the aisle frowned, unable to hide her disapproval. "She's so rude. I've seen her treat other passengers completely differently." James didn't respond. He simply lowered his gaze and quietly wiped up the spilled water. A heavy weight pressed on his heart. He had faced bullets and flames on the battlefield, but now, carrying the remains of his fallen comrade, he found himself enduring disrespect and discrimination from those he had once fought to protect. Throughout the flight, Lisa continued with petty acts of hostility. She ignored him when he signaled for more water, made a point of loudly reminding him to fasten his seatbelt when it wasn't necessary, and carried out each interaction under the guise of following protocol. James closed his eyes and took a deep breath, willing himself to remain composed. In his heart, he whispered, "Harper, we've been through hell together. This time I won't let anyone tarnish your honor." The The situation between Lisa and James Walker was more than just a personal conflict. It underscored a larger lesson about respect and compassion. Would Lisa come to understand her error? And how would James handle this injustice? As the plane reached cruising altitude, most passengers settled into a rhythm of quiet relaxation after the first few hours of the flight. Yet the atmosphere around James's seat remained heavy, like the calm before a storm. Lisa returned once more, this time standing directly in front of James's row. Her expression was stern, and her tone had grown even firmer. "Sir, we've received complaints from several passengers. They feel uncomfortable with an urn being in the cabin. I'm afraid I have to ask you to store it in the cargo hold to ensure the comfort of everyone on board." James lifted his head, his darkened eyes meeting Lisa's with a gaze so intense it seemed to pierce through her every word. His voice, slow but commanding, carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. "You're asking me to place the ashes of a soldier, a man who gave his life for this country, into the cargo hold? Do you think that's acceptable?" Lisa shrugged, a cold, detached smile crossing her lips. "Sir, I mean no disrespect, but this is about ensuring the comfort of other passengers. We don't want anyone to feel inconvenienced." Around them, more passengers began paying attention. Soft murmurs rippled through the cabin, with opinions beginning to split. "I don't think it's appropriate for him to keep something like that out in the open," a young woman whispered to her seatmate. "But isn't this going too far?" another passenger murmured, casting a disapproving glance at Lisa. James took a deep breath, striving for composure. He placed the urn firmly on his lap, covering it with both hands and the folded American flag. When he spoke again, his voice carried the sharp edge of restrained anger. "Do you have any idea what these ashes represent? This is a soldier who gave his life to protect the freedoms that you and I enjoy today. And you think I'll put him in the cargo hold alongside suitcases and duffel bags just because a few people are uncomfortable?" Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but James's steely gaze froze her for a moment. She quickly recovered, adjusting her tone slightly, though her words remained unyielding. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to the captain. This isn't a matter of personal feelings, it's about safety and the collective comfort of everyone on board." The young man sitting near James sprang to his feet, his frustration boiling over. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice carrying over the growing murmurs of the cabin. "You're harassing him for no reason. He's explained everything. The paperwork is in order, and more than that, he's a veteran. What you're doing is nothing short of insulting." Lisa turned to him, her expression faltering for a moment before regaining its firmness. "You're not in a position to make that call. I'm simply following protocol." Another voice chimed in, a sharp, authoritative tone from a middle-aged woman nearby. "Protocol? I've never heard of any protocol that involves humiliating someone like this. If you don't know how to do your job without disrespecting people, maybe it's time to stop." The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense, the low hum of conversation swelling into a chorus of discontent. Some passengers voiced their support for James, while others stayed neutral, simply watching the escalating drama unfold. But it was clear to everyone that the situation had reached a boiling point. Lisa, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to regain control. "Everyone, please remain calm. We'll resolve this matter quickly." James, who had been patient until now, felt a surge of anger rise within him. He stood, holding the urn firmly in his hands, and fixed his gaze on Lisa. "You think my silence is weakness? I've fought on battlefields, faced bullets, and lost those dearest to me. I don't need anyone's comfort or pity. I ask for one thing and one thing only: respect the person in this urn, because he gave his life for even those who don't deserve it." His words struck a chord. The cabin fell silent for a moment. A few passengers lowered their heads, ashamed. Lisa, her face betraying unease, clenched her jaw and held her ground. "Sir," she began, her voice firmer but tinged with nervousness, "I'm not going to argue with you. If you refuse to cooperate, I will." A voice interrupted her from the front of the cabin. "And what exactly do you think he's failed to cooperate with?" All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit was walking slowly down the aisle. His sharp gaze swept over the scene, and his steady voice carried an air of undeniable authority. "I'm Michael Roberts, head of customer service for this airline, and I've been observing your actions throughout this flight." Lisa froze in place, her face draining of color. Around them, Murmurs erupted among the passengers, their tone now shifting against her. Michael stopped in front of James and gave him a respectful nod. He then turned to Lisa, his tone calm but edged with firm professionalism. Mess. Lisa, I believe you owe this man, Mr. James Walker, a distinguished veteran and passenger on this flight, a thorough explanation for your behavior and attitude. The atmosphere in the cabin grew thick with tension, and all eyes were on Lisa and Michael Roberts. Lisa straightened her posture, clasping her hands in front of her stomach, but her usual confidence seemed to waver. In Michael's commanding presence, she struggled to maintain her composure. Her lips tightened, and her gaze darted between him and James. Mr. Roberts, Lisa began, her voice now defensive. I'm not sure why you think there's an issue with how I've handled this. I've simply been following safety protocols and ensuring passenger comfort. Michael studied her, his expression neutral but his voice resolute. MS. Lisa, I've been observing your actions from the beginning of this flight. Your requests and behavior toward Mr. James Walker not only exceeded the bounds of our regulations but also demonstrated a clear lack of respect. Not just me, but many passengers here have noticed this as well. Lisa frowned, her voice rising defensively as though cornered. I don't agree with these accusations. Everything I've done has followed proper protocol. If Mr. James feels offended, it's entirely a misunderstanding. I had no intention of being disrespectful. James, who had remained silent throughout much of the exchange, let out a wry smile. He placed the urn gently on his lap and fixed his sharp gaze on Lisa, his eyes cutting through her excuses. MS. Lisa, he began, his voice low but steady and piercing. Do you truly believe your actions so far were mere misunderstandings? Asking me to remove the American flag draped over my comrade's ashes, demanding I place them in the cargo hold, and serving me with blatant rudeness, all of that. Just a misunderstanding. Lisa turned to James, her dissatisfaction flashing in her eyes. I don't believe I was rude, she said tersely. I was simply fulfilling my duties. If you feel I didn't serve you well, I apologize for that, but Michael interrupted her, his tone colder now. Apologize for that? You're making it abundantly clear that you're not taking responsibility. Instead, you're shifting blame to others for feeling disrespected, rather than acknowledging your own behavior. I believe we need to end this debate here and look at the facts. Lisa took a step back, her eyes scanning the passengers around her, seeking support. A few people avoided her gaze, while others stared at her with visible disapproval. I truly haven't done anything wrong, Lisa said, raising her voice slightly, her frustration evident. If you're going to insist otherwise, then show me evidence. I can't accept being falsely accused. At that moment, a young woman near the back of the cabin stood up. Her hair was tied back in a high ponytail, and she held up her phone. Evidence? I think you'll want to take a look at this, the woman said, her tone edged with mockery. Lisa froze, her eyes widening as the woman stepped forward and held her phone out for Michael and the surrounding passengers to see. The phone screen displayed a video that captured the entire incident, Lisa's dismissive request to inspect the urn, her stern and condescending demeanor as she insisted Mr. James place the urn in the cargo hold, and her words dripping with superiority. In the video, Lisa's voice was clear and damning. You can't keep this here, sir. Other passengers feel uncomfortable. This is a safety regulation. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to escalate to the captain. The footage also showed James's calm yet commanding responses, along with the indignation of nearby passengers who had spoken up in his defense. Michael watched the video in silence. When it ended, he looked up at Lisa, his gaze colder and sharper than before. Mess. Lisa, he said evenly, do you have anything else to say for yourself? Lisa stood frozen, her face pale. Her lips moved as though she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Passengers around her began to voice their opinions. Is this how she treats people? Shameful. Treating a veteran like that? Completely unacceptable. I saw it all. She's been targeting him from the start. Lisa swallowed hard and lowered her eyes. After a long pause, she stammered, I didn't mean it that way. Maybe I was a bit rigid, but I didn't intend to be disrespectful. Michael sighed, his voice low but firm. Being rigid is not an excuse for unprofessional and disrespectful behavior. You treated a passenger unfairly, especially someone who has dedicated his life to serving this country. Lisa's head dropped further as the murmurs of disapproval around her grew louder, amplifying the weight of her discomfort. After a moment, she mumbled a weak apology. "Mr. James, I'm sorry." But James didn't respond. He simply looked at her for a long moment before lowering his gaze again, his hands tightening around the urn as though it were a silent testament to all he had endured. The tension in the economy cabin lingered, heavy and unresolved. Lisa stood there, dazed and unsure of her next move, while the murmurs of discontent from the passengers swirled around her. No one seemed inclined to offer her sympathy. Michael Roberts, having watched the video one more time, turned to Lisa. His gaze was sharp but not hostile. He took a deep breath, then addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice clear and steady. "First and foremost, I extend my deepest apologies to everyone on this flight, and especially to Mr. James Walker." He turned to face James, bowing deeply in a gesture of genuine respect. The cabin fell silent for a moment. "Mr. Walker," Michael continued, "on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for the unprofessional behavior of certain staff members on this flight. There is no justification for the disrespect you have endured." James looked at Michael, his eyes still sharp but softened slightly by the man's sincere demeanor. He gave a small nod but remained silent, maintaining the calm, composed demeanor he had carried throughout the ordeal. Michael continued, this time addressing the passengers. "As an airline, our duty is not just to transport people safely, but to ensure every passenger is treated with respect and dignity. What happened today is unacceptable, and we take full responsibility to ensure mistakes like this will not happen again." A wave of applause began to ripple through the cabin. Though not thunderous, it was strong enough for Michael to feel the passengers' agreement and support. Lisa remained frozen, unable to raise her head. Michael's words felt like daggers to her pride, but it was James's silent, steady gaze that stung the most. Her voice trembling, Lisa finally managed to speak. "Mr. Walker, I truly apologize if my actions made you feel disrespected. I thought I was just doing my duty, but now I see. I was too rigid." James looked at her, his calm yet powerful eyes holding hers. He spoke slowly, each word resonating throughout the cabin. "Lisa, what pains me isn't your lack of respect for me. I've faced prejudice all my life, and it doesn't surprise me anymore. What truly disappoints me is your lack of respect for a soldier who gave his life for this country. The flag draped over this urn isn't just a piece of cloth. It represents a life, a sacrifice, and honor." Lisa lowered her head, her lips trembling as words failed her. For the first time, she fully grasped the weight of her actions. James's words felt like an indictment she couldn't deny. Michael nodded in agreement with James. Turning to Lisa, his tone remained firm but carried a glimmer of opportunity. "Ms. Lisa, I hope you understand that what you've done today is more than a lapse in service. This is a lesson in empathy and responsibility. If you can't learn from it, I'm afraid today will be your last day working for this airline." Lisa looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. She couldn't muster a response, only nodding as a sign of acknowledgement and regret. A middle-aged woman, the same passenger who had spoken up earlier, unexpectedly stood and began clapping loudly. Others quickly followed, and the cabin filled with applause. This time, it wasn't to criticize Lisa, it was to honor James Walker. The woman stepped closer to James, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. Her voice was thick with emotion as she said, "Thank you, sir, for everything you've done. We owe you, and those like your comrade, a debt of gratitude that words could never express." James nodded slightly, still silent. His hands tightened around the urn, his gaze distant, as though he were speaking to Harper in his mind. Michael turned to Lisa and spoke softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Ms. Lisa, when we land, I want you to reflect deeply on what has happened here. Our airline doesn't just need people who follow procedures. We need people who put their hearts into every action. You can make amends, but only if you're truly willing to change." Lisa nodded, for the first time neither resisting nor offering an excuse. Michael turned back to James, bowed once more, and then walked toward the front of the cabin, leaving behind a silence heavy with emotion. As the plane continued its journey in a calmer atmosphere, Lisa stole a glance at James from afar. His words echoed in her mind, stirring an unfamiliar urge to make things right. James sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the window, where sunlight bathed the endless white clouds. A small part of his pain had subsided, but the memory of Harper remained, an eternal flame in his heart. The hum of the plane's engines continued to fill the cabin, but the tension from earlier had largely dissipated. Lisa stood motionless at her station, her face still pale. The words from Michael and the reactions of the passengers weighed heavily on her, hammering at her pride and forcing her to confront her actions. Michael Roberts stood firm, his stern eyes fixed on Lisa. After allowing a few moments of silence for her to reflect, he spoke, his voice low yet commanding. "Lisa, your actions not only disrespected Mr. James Walker, but they also disrupted the experience for other passengers. I am deeply dissatisfied with how you handled this situation." Lisa lowered her head, unable to meet Michael's gaze. She stammered, offering a weak attempt at justification. "Mr. Roberts, I was just following the rules. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, I thought." "No," Michael interrupted, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Do you think you can excuse your behavior by hiding behind the rules? Rules are meant to guide us, not to be used as a shield to harm passengers. What you did is entirely unacceptable." At that moment, a voice rang out from the front of the cabin, drawing the attention of everyone, including Lisa and Michael. "What's going on here?" All eyes turned toward the speaker. It was the captain of the flight, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform adorned with the airline's insignia on his shoulders. His expression was stern but calm, maintaining the professional demeanor expected of someone in his position. The captain walked down the aisle, stopping in front of Michael before turning to Lisa with a scrutinizing look. "I've been informed by the cabin crew about a tense situation in the economy section. Can someone explain to me what's going on?" Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Captain, I believe you should watch this video before I explain further." The young woman who had recorded the video quickly handed her phone to the captain. He took it, watching the footage with a growing seriousness etched across his face. When he finished, he nodded, returned the phone, and turned to Lisa. His voice was low but icy. "MS. Lisa, I'd like to hear your explanation." Lisa opened her mouth to speak, but even she didn't know how to justify what had transpired. She stammered incoherently, then lowered her head in silence. The captain took a deep breath before addressing the passengers. He bowed deeply, a gesture so unexpected that the entire cabin fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, as the captain of this flight, I extend my deepest and most sincere apologies on behalf of the airline and crew, especially to you, Mr. James Walker." He stepped closer to James, his expression radiating profound respect. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for what you've endured during this flight. The behavior of certain members of the crew does not reflect the values or standards of this airline. I will personally ensure this matter is addressed appropriately with upper management." James nodded, his calm and dignified demeanor unshaken. His voice was steady as he replied, "Thank you, Captain. I don't expect special treatment, but I do believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, especially when it involves the honor of someone who has sacrificed everything." The captain nodded again before turning to Lisa, his tone growing sharper. "MS. Lisa, upon landing, I require you to write a full report detailing this incident from start to finish. You will submit it to HR immediately. Additionally, I will escalate this matter to senior management for further review." Lisa's face turned pale, but she didn't protest. "Yes, Captain," she murmured, her voice so faint it was barely audible. The captain nodded and addressed the passengers once more. "Once again, I deeply apologize for this incident. The airline will take steps to ensure that situations like this never happen again. Thank you for your patience and understanding." After the captain's apology, a few passengers began clapping, expressing their support for his decisive handling of the situation. The atmosphere in the cabin lightened somewhat, though many eyes remained on Lisa, who now stood motionless, her presence dimmed like a shadow. Lisa no longer dared to meet anyone's gaze. Every glance, every judgment from the passengers, and the damning video replayed over and over in her mind. She realized that her earlier justifications were nothing more than feeble excuses. As she walked back down the aisle, Lisa passed by James and softly murmured, almost in a whisper, "Mr. Walker, I'm sorry, I was wrong." James lifted his head and looked at her for a long moment. Finally, he gave a slight nod but said nothing more. Her apology was a start, but he understood that actions following those words would matter far more. Lisa sat quietly in the crew area, beginning to write the first lines of her report. The images from the video and James's words echoed in her mind. This was not just a professional lesson, it was a profound life lesson. In the business class section, Michael observed the situation from a distance. He knew Lisa's transformation would not happen overnight, but he believed that today's events had planted a seed. James, seated by the window, gently rested his hand on the urn in his lap. He gazed outside at the brilliant sunlight streaming over the clouds, feeling a small sense of peace returning. The plane touched down at the airport, the soft chime of the announcement signaling the end of a turbulent journey. As the cabin doors opened, passengers began to disembark, but none left without casting respectful glances toward James Walker. They weren't just honoring a veteran, they admired the dignity and composure he had shown throughout the flight. Before James could leave his seat, the captain himself waited at the exit, accompanied by the entire crew. Michael Roberts stood nearby, along with several airline officials, ready to express their appreciation and apologize once again. The captain approached James, his gaze filled with deep respect. He bowed solemnly before speaking. "Mr. Walker, on behalf of myself and the entire crew, I want to thank you and your comrades for your sacrifices in service to our country. This flight has been a profound lesson for all of us. We owe you and those like you a debt of gratitude from the depths of our hearts." The captain placed a hand over his heart and bowed once more. The entire crew standing beside him followed suit, inclining their heads in unison. Even the remaining passengers in the cabin bowed slightly, and some were visibly moved to tears. James stood still, his hands firmly holding the urn, his expression briefly flickering with surprise at this collective gesture. After a moment, he nodded and spoke in his deep, warm voice. "Thank you. Thank you all," James said, his voice steady but filled with weight. "But the gratitude does not belong to me. It belongs to the one resting in this urn and to the thousands of others who gave their lives on the battlefield." Michael stepped forward again, bowing deeply to James. Speaking on behalf of the airline, his tone was filled with genuine remorse. "Mr. Walker, on behalf of the airline's leadership, I extend my deepest apologies to you. What occurred today represents a serious failure in our service, and I assure you that strict measures will be taken to address this immediately. No passenger, especially someone like you, should ever endure this again." James nodded slightly in response. He said nothing further, but the calm look in his eyes seemed to carry a message he would wait to see if their promises would be fulfilled. Lisa stood silently behind the rest of the crew, her head bowed, avoiding the gaze of both James and the passengers. Her presence felt like an unwanted spotlight, drawing attention she wished she could avoid. The criticisms and judgmental looks from the passengers throughout the flight echoed in her mind, lingering like an unshakable reminder of her failure. Yet, in the quiet corner of her mind, the genuine regret she had expressed began to waver. Lisa knew she had another way out. As passengers disembarked, Lisa quickly retreated to a secluded area reserved for the crew. Once alone, she pulled out her phone and dialed the familiar number. Her voice was low but carried an unusual confidence that had been absent during the flight. "It's me," she said. "I had an issue on the flight, and I need your help." On the other end of the line, a man's voice responded with a composed and authoritative tone. It was her brother, a senior executive at the airline, with enough influence to sway decisions about personnel. "What happened, Lisa? Is it serious?" Lisa slowly recounted the incident, but instead of acknowledging her mistakes, she emphasized that she had been misunderstood and unfairly treated by Michael Roberts and the rest of the crew. Her voice grew more indignant as she went on. "You know me, don't you? I always follow the rules. This was blown out of proportion. Michael Roberts deliberately humiliated me in front of everyone, and that veteran. I didn't mean anything bad, but they're twisting everything against me." The man on the other end sighed heavily. "All right. Don't worry about it. I'll handle this. Just go home and rest, I'll take care of it." Lisa hung up, a wave of relief washing over her. Straightening her uniform, she walked out of the crew area with her head held higher, as though the apology she had given earlier on the plane was no longer necessary. As Lisa left the airport, any lingering feelings of guilt or regret were gone. Instead, she convinced herself she was simply a victim of misunderstanding. Her eyes regained their usual confidence, even tinged with a hint of coldness, as though the incident had been resolved entirely in her favor. "I've already apologized. That's enough," Lisa thought to herself. "This has nothing to do with my career. Anyway, my brother will make sure they don't make things difficult for me." What Lisa didn't realize was that every glance on the plane, the words and actions of Michael, the captain, and James had left an indelible mark. And soon she would be forced to confront the truth again, this time without the shield of familial protection. While Lisa sought to avoid responsibility by leaning on family connections, James and the other passengers left the airport, carrying the story of that fateful flight with them. It wasn't just confined to the airplane cabin, it would soon spread far and wide, ensuring Lisa couldn't escape it forever. The next morning, at the airline's headquarters, an emergency meeting was convened to address the incident on the previous day's flight. In the spacious conference room, a tense and serious atmosphere hung in the air. The captain, Michael Roberts, Lisa, and several senior airline executives were present. Notably, Henry Cartwright, Lisa's brother and the airline's vice president of human resources, was also in attendance. Lisa entered the room, maintaining her composure. Though she felt anxious inside, her brother's presence gave her confidence that she wouldn't face severe consequences. Michael began the meeting with a calm but authoritative tone. "Thank you all for being here. We are gathered to address a serious issue involving the service provided on yesterday's flight. I trust we can all prioritize the interests of the airline and our customers." Lisa was asked to submit her written report. Everyone in the room, including the captain and Michael, read through it attentively. As they did, their expressions grew increasingly grim. In her report, Lisa did not admit to any wrongdoing as she had briefly done on the plane. Instead, she emphasized that all her actions were in accordance with procedure and intended to ensure the safety of the flight. She claimed that the situation was a misunderstanding and that she had no intention of offending Mr. James Walker or any other passengers. Lisa also made a point to highlight her years of dedicated service and her previously unblemished record. The captain placed the report on the table, his eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and disappointment. Michael Roberts furrowed his brow, his gaze lingering on Lisa for a long moment before he spoke. "Ms. Lisa, I'm genuinely surprised. This report does not reflect what actually transpired on the flight, especially not the words and actions you displayed in front of the passengers. Are you certain this is everything you want to say about the incident?" Lisa held her head high, her voice confident. "Mr. Roberts, I was simply doing my duty. I had no intention of offending anyone. If there was a misunderstanding, I already apologized on the flight." The captain's tone was stern, but this report shows no sign of remorse. It even shifts blame onto the passenger and emphasizes that you did nothing wrong. Lisa maintained her calm demeanor but glanced toward her brother, seeking his support. Henry Cartwright, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "Michael, I understand your concerns, but we also need to approach this matter objectively. Lisa was following safety procedures. Perhaps she mishandled the situation, but I believe her intentions were good." Michael met Henry's gaze directly, his tone sharper. "Mr. Cartwright, I respect your opinion, but yesterday's incident wasn't just about procedures. It involved attitude, discrimination, and unprofessional conduct. Do you truly think this was just a misunderstanding?" Henry frowned slightly but held firm under Lisa's expectant gaze. "I believe we shouldn't jump to conclusions without enough concrete evidence." Michael nodded and then slowly placed a USB drive on the table. "Plugging it into the projector," he said. "In that case, let's watch this video before making any judgments." The room fell into complete silence as the video began to play. The footage from the flight appeared on the screen, showing the entire incident from the moment Lisa asked Mr. James Walker to remove the American flag draped over the urn to her dismissive tone and disrespectful actions. Her voice rang out clearly in the recording. "You can't keep this here. Some passengers are uncomfortable. This is a safety regulation. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to inform the captain." Lisa's expressions in the video, ranging from rigid to condescending, left little room for defense. Each of her words and actions contrasted starkly with James Walker's calm and dignified responses, painting her in an undeniably negative light. As the video ended, the room was blanketed in a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Henry, who had defended Lisa from the start, now looked visibly unsettled. He turned to his sister, his face etched with disappointment. "Lisa," he began, his voice significantly softer, "you didn't tell me the whole truth. Do you honestly believe your behavior in this video was appropriate?" Lisa lowered her head, unable to muster a response. She knew her justifications were now utterly meaningless. The captain shook his head and looked to Michael before speaking. "I think everything is clear now. This incident hasn't just damaged Mr. James Walker's dignity, it has severely harmed our airline's reputation. Lisa will need to be held accountable for her actions." Henry sighed, his face marked with deep conflict. After a moment of heavy silence, he stood, his gaze stern as he turned toward Lisa. "Lisa, I cannot protect you in this situation. What you did was not just wrong to the customer, it betrayed my trust. I will not interfere with the airline's handling of your case." Lisa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. A sense of isolation and failure overwhelmed her. Michael rose and delivered the final words of the meeting. "Lisa's actions need to be thoroughly reviewed. I recommend suspending her pending further investigation and a final decision on disciplinary measures." The meeting adjourned, but the tension lingered. Lisa left the room, her heart heavy, though deep down, she still struggled to fully accept responsibility for her actions. She realized that nothing would be easy from this point on, and for the first time she was entirely alone. James Walker, though absent from the meeting, had become a symbol of patience and the quiet dignity of a soldier. The story of the flight was only beginning to spread, serving as a powerful lesson for the airline and individuals like Lisa. After the meeting, Lisa returned to her office. She had barely sat down when the door swung open. Henry Cartwright, her brother, entered, his expression icy, his sharp eyes cutting through any excuse she might have prepared. "Lisa," he began, his voice low but brimming with authority, "we need to talk." Now, Lisa stood still, her shoulders trembling slightly. She knew this time her brother's anger would not be easily quelled. "What were you thinking when you wrote that report?" Henry asked, his disappointment unmistakable. "Did you think blaming procedure and justifying yourself with safety concerns would make everything okay? Do you understand that what you did not only hurt Mr. James Walker but also betrayed everyone's trust?" Lisa stammered, trying to defend herself. I just thought I needed to protect myself. I didn't mean to deceive you, but I also didn't want to take all the blame." Not wanting to take the blame, Henry interrupted, his voice rising. "Lisa, this isn't about some minor mistake. This is about the honor of a veteran, the reputation of this airline, and your personal integrity. You didn't just make a mistake, you tried to use me as a shield to avoid accountability. Don't you see how serious that is?" Henry's words cut through Lisa's pride like a sharp blade. She lowered her head, unable to respond, her silence a tacit admission of guilt. Henry stepped closer, his voice softening but still carrying the weight of his authority. "Lisa, I trusted you. I thought you were someone who could take responsibility, but this time you've deeply disappointed me. If you can't recognize your mistakes and change, not only I, but this airline won't be able to stand by you." Lisa looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. Her brother's words struck a chord, shaking her to her core. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice trembling but sincere. "Brother, I'm sorry, truly sorry, not just for letting you down, but for what I did to Mr. Walker. I was wrong, and I want to make things right." Henry studied her carefully, his gaze softening as he saw the sincerity in her expression. Slowly he nodded. "If you truly understand that, then prove it through your actions. Not for me, but for your own integrity." 3 days later, Henry convened a special meeting at the airline's headquarters. The atmosphere in the conference room was more solemn than usual, as a special guest was in attendance, Mr. James Walker. When James entered, the room fell silent. This time he did not carry the urn from the flight. Instead, he wore a formal military uniform adorned with shining medals neatly displayed on his chest. His tall, lean frame carried the commanding presence of a seasoned soldier, and everyone in the room couldn't help but feel a deep respect for him. The captain, Michael Roberts, and all the senior executives rose to their feet. Henry stepped forward, extending his hand to James and speaking with reverence. "Mr. Walker, thank you for accepting our invitation to be here today. This is an opportunity for us to personally extend our apologies and to address the matter transparently." James nodded, his calm gaze sweeping across the room. He said nothing but took the seat prepared for him, waiting. Henry gestured for Lisa to step forward. She rose and walked toward James, the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her. The tension was suffocating, but she steadied herself and began to speak. "Mr. Walker," she started, her voice trembling slightly, "first and foremost, I want to extend my deepest apologies to you. I was wrong in my behavior, and I have no excuse to justify it. I was rigid, arrogant, and disrespectful not just to you, but to the values you and your comrades represent." She bowed deeply. then continued. In the past few days, I've done a lot of reflection. I realized that I relied on my brother's position to avoid accountability instead of confronting my mistakes. That wasn't just wrong, it was cowardly. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, but I truly hope to have the opportunity to make amends. James watched her silently. His sharp eyes, devoid of anger, seemed to weigh every word she spoke. After a moment he responded, his deep voice calm yet commanding. MS. Lisa, your apology today is a good start. But true remorse cannot end with words alone. It must be demonstrated through actions. If you truly wish to make amends, then show me and everyone here through what you do next. Lisa nodded firmly, her voice trembling but filled with determination. Sir, I will. I'll start by joining organizations that support veterans and learning to appreciate the values I've ignored. I will do everything I can to make amends. As the meeting concluded, James walked out of the room, his presence leaving a profound impression on everyone. He didn't say anything more, but his quiet dignity spoke volumes. For the first time in days, Lisa felt a sense of relief. She knew her words were just the beginning, and a long journey of redemption lay ahead. But this time she was ready to face it, not because of pressure from her brother or her job, but for her own honor. 3 weeks after the meeting, Lisa began her journey of making amends. James Walker's words were not just a reminder but became a guiding principle, pushing her to confront her shortcomings and grow. Lisa registered with a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting veterans and their families. On her first day, she felt out of place among people whose stories were etched with sacrifice, pain, and resilience. But she didn't back down. At a gathering held by the organization, Lisa was introduced to Eleanor, an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Eleanor was the mother of a soldier who had died in the war, and her story deeply moved Lisa. My son Mark was just 22 when he passed, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. He told me he was fighting not just for his family but for everyone in this country, even for those who don't understand the value of sacrifice. Her eyes were filled with tears, yet they shone with pride. Lisa lowered her head, her voice choked. Mrs. Eleanor, I am so sorry for what happened. I used to be someone who didn't understand that value, and I disrespected a veteran. But I'm here to make things right and learn to honor what I once took for granted. Eleanor placed her hand over Lisa's, gripping it tightly as if passing on her strength. Child, the most important thing is that you've recognized your mistake and are working to change. What you're doing today is something my son would be proud of. One day, Lisa received word from the organization about an upcoming ceremony honoring veterans at the Central Square. She decided to participate as a volunteer, helping organize the event. When the ceremony began, Lisa was stunned to see James Walker standing on the main stage. He wore the same formal military uniform she had seen during the meeting, the sunlight reflecting off his gleaming medals. For a moment, Lisa froze, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. She took a deep breath and steadied herself, ready to continue her journey of making things right. In his speech, James spoke of his fallen comrades, honoring the noble values of sacrifice and service. He made no mention of the incident on the plane, but every word felt like a silent message to Lisa, reminding her of why she was there. After the ceremony, Lisa decided to approach James. She bowed her head slightly and spoke in a quiet but sincere voice. Mr. Walker, thank you for being here today. I am so grateful to have heard your words. I am still working to make amends, and your presence has been a tremendous source of inspiration for me. James looked at her, his gaze no longer stern but softer now. He nodded slowly and said, Ms. Lisa, I noticed you here from the start of the ceremony. Your presence speaks volumes. I hope you will continue on this path, not just to make amends but to do what is right. Lisa smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting a newfound determination. Sir, I won't stop. I promise. Beyond participating in activities supporting veterans, Lisa wrote a heartfelt letter to all employees at the airline, sharing her story. In the letter, she didn't shy away from her mistakes, openly admitting how her arrogance and ignorance had hurt others. I'm writing this letter not to seek forgiveness but to remind everyone, including myself, that respect and empathy must always come first in our work and our lives, she wrote. The letter quickly circulated within the airline and received overwhelmingly positive responses. Some employees said Lisa's story helped them understand the importance of attitude in service, while others admired her courage in facing her mistakes and working to make things right. When Lisa returned home after the ceremony, She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a completely different version of herself. No longer the overconfident person who relied on her brother's influence, she now understood that true change comes from within. She smiled and whispered to herself, "This journey has only just begun, but I won't stop. I want to be worthy of the trust of those who have forgiven me and the respect of those I once hurt." Somewhere, James Walker was smiling as well. He knew that this time, Lisa had truly changed. Lisa's journey of making amends didn't stop with the initial steps. Despite receiving recognition from the Veterans Support Organization and some colleagues at the airline, she still faced skeptical glances from those who weren't convinced she had truly changed. One morning, as Lisa walked into the office, she overheard whispers from down the hallway. Two colleagues stood near the coffee machine, unaware of her approach. "She's really good at putting on a show. Just last week she was reprimanded, and now she's spreading that letter like she's some kind of hero. Only got away with it because her brother shielded her. If it weren't for him, she'd have been fired ages ago. I don't believe she's sincere." Lisa stopped in the hallway, the sting of their words cutting deep. But instead of walking away or confronting them, she took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and stepped forward. "Good morning," she said with a small smile, making the two colleagues turn around, startled. Lisa continued, her voice calm. "I understand if you doubt my changes, that's fair. But I hope that, through time and my actions, I can show you I'm genuinely trying." The two colleagues were caught off guard, mumbling awkward responses. Lisa didn't linger. She entered her office, feeling a sense of relief for handling the situation with composure. In the days that followed, Lisa was assigned to lead a new training project for the airline staff, focused on improving service attitudes and fostering empathy toward passengers. It was not only a challenging task but also a true test of her resolve. During her first training session, Lisa stood in front of a room full of employees, many of whom were aware of her past mistakes. She could feel the weight of their skeptical gazes. She smiled and began with an admission. "Hello everyone, my name is Lisa, and yes, some of you may have heard my story. It's true I made serious mistakes in serving a passenger. But that's precisely why I'm here today. Not as someone who has it all figured out, but as someone who learned a valuable lesson from her failures." The room grew quiet. Lisa went on to share her story, from her poor decisions on the flight, to James Walker's measured response, to the steps she'd taken to make amends. "The most important thing I've learned," she concluded, "is that service isn't just a job. It's a profound responsibility. It requires us to put our hearts into even the smallest actions." Her story created a reflective mood in the room. Some employees even approached her after the session to express their respect and appreciation for her honesty. After completing the training project, Lisa returned to the Veterans Support Organization where she had been volunteering. Eleanor, the elderly woman in the wheelchair, took Lisa's hand in hers, her voice filled with pride. "Child, you've come so far. Mark would have been proud of you. Lisa, you've come further than I ever expected. I've always believed that mistakes don't define a person, it's how you overcome them that truly matters." Lisa smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, Eleanor. Your words of wisdom have meant so much to me. I promise I'll keep trying." One late afternoon, Lisa received a letter. Opening it, she immediately recognized the familiar slanted handwriting. It was from James Walker. "Lisa, I've heard about the work you're doing, and I'm very proud of your journey. Not everyone has the courage to face their mistakes, and even fewer dare to rectify them. Your path hasn't been easy, but you've proven that you're strong enough to persevere. I hope you continue to spread that spirit, not just in your work but in all aspects of your life. With respect. Dear James Walker." Yow, reading the letter, Lisa couldn't stop the tears that welled up and spilled down her cheeks. For the first time, she felt a sense of true forgiveness, not just from James Walker, but from herself. Folding the letter carefully, her eyes shone with determination. Lisa knew her journey of atonement wasn't over, but the steps she had taken were laying the foundation for profound change. This time, she no longer feared the judgmental stares of those around her. She understood that true transformation would take time and steadfast resolve, and she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As time passed, Lisa became a symbol of change and resilience within the airline. Her story wasn't just a lesson in correcting mistakes, it became an inspiration for others to confront their own flaws and strive for growth. On a beautiful spring day, the airline hosted a Veterans Appreciation Ceremony in the heart of the city. The event was not only a tribute to the soldiers who had sacrificed their lives, but also a way to spread the message of gratitude and respect. Lisa, as one of the event's co-organizers, had spent weeks preparing for the occasion. She wanted it to be more than just a formal ceremony. She wanted it to be an opportunity for people to deeply understand the values that soldiers like James Walker had defended with their lives. During the ceremony, James Walker, the veteran Lisa had once clashed with on that fateful flight, stepped onto the stage. He was dressed in a pristine military uniform, his medals gleaming under the sunlight, and his bright eyes radiating dignity despite the streaks of gray in his hair. "Today is not just about honoring soldiers like me and my comrades," James said, his deep, warm voice resonating throughout the hall. "It's also a reminder to all of us that respect and gratitude are not to be taken for granted. They must be demonstrated through our actions and in how we treat one another every day." James smiled, his gaze shifting to Lisa, who stood near the stage. He added, "And I want to extend a special thank you to Ms. Lisa. She has shown that mistakes do not define a person, how they make amends does. I am incredibly proud of her journey." The hall erupted in applause. Lisa bowed her head, tears brimming in her eyes, her heart filled with gratitude. After the event, Lisa approached James, this time not to apologize but to express heartfelt thanks. "Mr. Walker, thank you for believing in me and for encouraging me. What you've said and done has changed my life. I will continue to uphold and spread the values you and your comrades fought so hard to protect." James nodded, his eyes gentle. "Lisa, you've done it, and I know you'll continue to inspire others." Lisa returned to her work, but this time she wasn't just an airline attendant. She was appointed to lead a special training program focused on empathy and respect in customer service. Her sessions were filled with stories, emotions, and meaningful lessons that resonated deeply with her trainees. One day, the airline received a letter from a passenger who had been on the same flight as James Walker. The letter read, "Lisa's story is proof that anyone can change and do better as long as they're willing to face themselves. Thank you for showing us hope in the capacity of humans to grow." Lisa read the letter and smiled. She knew that while this chapter of her journey had come to a close, the values she had committed to would continue to guide her and inspire others. Lisa's story ends here, but its message lives on. Life always offers us opportunities to correct our mistakes and grow, if we're brave enough to confront ourselves. If you found this story meaningful, please support our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to help spread inspiring stories to more people. Let these positive values become a driving force for all of us to change and improve ourselves each day. Thank you for joining us, and see you in our next story.